If you're living in America right now, you're probably breaking at least 3 laws from the 1800s without even knowing it. And the worst part, these laws are still technically enforceable today. We like to think we live in a modern society with modern rules, but buried deep in the legal codes of states across America are laws that were written when people traveled by horse and communicated by telegram. And nobody bothered to remove them. These aren't just weird suggestions or old traditions. These are actual laws that are still on the books right now. Some are hilarious, some are absolutely insane, and some will make you wonder what the hell was going on in the 1800s. Today we're going through 50 of the freakiest laws from that era that somehow still apply in the United States. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll be questioning everything. Here's the thing about old laws. They never really go away unless someone actively removes them. And when you've got thousands of laws being created over decades, nobody has the time or energy to go back and clean up the ones that don't make sense anymore. So what happens? They just sit there, waiting. Technically enforceable. Which means that right now, as you're watching this video, you could be violating a law that was created before your great-great-grandparents were even born. The challenge with these 1800s laws is that they were written for a completely different world. A world without cars, without electricity, without the internet. A world where people had very different concerns and very different ideas about what needed to be illegal. But the law doesn't care about context. If it's still on the books, it's still a law. Let us start with some of the laws that actually make you scratch your head and wonder if this is real life. In Alabama, it's illegal to wear a fake mustache in church that causes laughter. This law dates back to the 1800s, when apparently there was such a serious problem with people disrupting church services with fake facial hair that lawmakers decided they needed to step in. Imagine being the person who had to write this law. Imagine being in a room full of serious legislators and someone stands up and says, "Gentlemen, we have a fake mustache crisis on our hands." And everyone just nodded and agreed. This law is still active, which means technically if you show up to church in Alabama with a fake mustache and people start laughing, you're breaking the law. Moving over to Arizona, it's illegal for donkeys to sleep in bathtubs. Yes, you heard that right. Donkeys in bathtubs. This law was actually created after a real incident in the 1920s, but it was based on similar livestock laws from the 1800s. Apparently, a merchant's donkey escaped, fell asleep in a bathtub, and when a local dam broke, the bathtub floated away with the donkey still in it. The town had to spend resources rescuing this bathtub surfing donkey, so they made it illegal. But here's the crazy part. This law is still enforceable today. So if you live in Arizona and you've been letting your donkey take baths, you're technically a criminal. California has a law stating that it's illegal to whistle for a lost canary before 8 in the morning. This law comes from the late 1800s when keeping canaries was extremely popular, and apparently people were so annoying about whistling for their escaped birds early in the morning that neighbors demanded legal action. The law is still on the books, which means if you lose your canary at 7 in the morning and you start whistling to find it, you're breaking a law that's over 100 years old. The mental image of police showing up at your door because you were whistling too early is absolutely ridiculous. In Connecticut, a pickle must bounce to be considered a pickle. This sounds like a joke, but it's a real law from the 1800s. The reasoning was that pickles that don't bounce are too soft and therefore not properly pickled. State officials would literally drop pickles on the ground, and if they didn't bounce, they weren't legally considered pickles. This was apparently such an important issue that it needed to be written into law, and nobody has bothered to remove it. So technically, Connecticut still has official standards for pickle bounciness. Delaware has a law that makes it illegal to fly over any body of water without sufficient supplies of food and drink. This law was written in the late 1800s and was meant for hot air balloons, which were the main form of air travel at the time. The concern was that if you crashed into water, you needed provisions to survive until rescue arrived. But the law was never updated when airplanes became a thing. So technically, it still applies to all aircraft. Every single commercial flight that passes over water in Delaware airspace is technically required to have food and drinks, which they do anyway. But it's wild that this balloon law from over a century ago is the reason why. Florida made it illegal to sing in a public place while wearing a swimsuit. This law dates back to the late 1800s when beach culture was just starting, and conservative lawmakers were terrified of people having too much fun near the ocean. The combination of singing and swimsuits was apparently too scandalous to allow, so they banned it. And this law has never been repealed, which means every beach party in Florida where someone starts singing is technically an illegal gathering. In Georgia, it's illegal to keep a donkey in a bathtub. Wait, didn't we already cover this? No, that was Arizona. Georgia has its own separate donkey bathtub law. This means that at two different points in American history, in two different states, lawmakers looked at the situation and thought, you know what, donkeys in bathtubs. That's the issue we need to address. The fact that this happened twice is absolutely insane. Idaho has a law stating that it's illegal for a man to give his girlfriend a box of chocolates that weighs less than 50 pounds. This law was created in the 1800s and was meant to ensure that men were serious about their courtship. If you were going to give a woman chocolates, you better be committed enough to give her 50 pounds of them. Anything less was considered insulting. Can you imagine trying to follow this law today? Sorry, honey, I know you wanted a small box of truffles, but legally I have to give you this massive crate that weighs as much as a small child. In Illinois, it's illegal to speak English. Wait, what? Let me clarify. The official language of Illinois is American, not English. This law was written in the 1800s as a symbolic middle finger to Britain after the Revolutionary War. Lawmakers wanted to make it clear that Americans spoke American, not English. The law was never removed, which means technically everyone in Illinois speaking English is breaking the law and should be speaking American instead, whatever that means. Indiana has a law that requires all cars entering the state to stop and fire 3 gunshots in the air as a warning signal. This law comes from the late 1800s, when automobiles were brand new and terrifying to everyone. Horses would freak out when they saw cars. So the solution was to make cars announce themselves with gunfire, because apparently the sound of gunshots is less scary to horses than the sight of a car. This law is still on the books, which means technically every single person driving into Indiana should be locked up for not firing warning shots. Iowa made it illegal for one-armed piano players to perform for money. This incredibly specific law dates back to the 1800s, and historians aren't entirely sure why it exists. Some think it was meant to protect traditional two-handed piano players from competition. Others think it was some weird discrimination thing. Either way, if you've only got one arm and you're a talented pianist in Iowa, tough luck. The law says you can't make money from your talent. In Kansas, it's illegal to serve wine in teacups. This law was created during the temperance movement of the late 1800s, when people were trying to ban alcohol. Apparently, some sneaky folks were serving wine in teacups to get around the stigma of drinking in public, so lawmakers specifically banned the practice. The law never got removed, which means every fancy tea party in Kansas that jokes about putting wine in the teacups is actually discussing a criminal act. Kentucky has a law stating that every person must take a bath at least once a year. This law dates back to the 1800s, when personal hygiene was apparently such a problem that the government had to legally mandate bathing. Once a year, that was the standard. If you bathed once every 365 days, you were in compliance. The fact that this needed to be a law is genuinely disturbing, and it's still legally enforceable, which means if you go more than a year without bathing in Kentucky, you're technically a criminal, although you've got bigger problems than legal ones at that point. Louisiana made it illegal to gargle in public. This law comes from the late 1800s, when tuberculosis was a major health crisis and people were terrified of spreading disease through any kind of public spitting or gargling, so they just banned gargling entirely. Nobody has removed this law, which means if you're walking down the street in New Orleans and you decide to gargle some mouthwash, you're breaking a law that's over a century old. In Maine, it's illegal to step out of a plane while it's in flight. Now, you might think, well, obviously that's just suicide, but this law was actually written in the 1800s about hot air balloons. People would sometimes jump out of balloons with primitive parachutes as a stunt, and lawmakers decided this was too dangerous to allow. The law still applies to modern aircraft, which means technically every skydiver in Maine is a criminal. Parachuting is a violation of a balloon law from the 1800s. Maryland has a law that makes it illegal to take a lion to the movies. This law dates back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when traveling circuses were common and exotic animals were sometimes brought into public spaces. Apparently, someone tried to bring a lion into a movie theater. It caused chaos, and lawmakers said never again. This law has never been repealed, so if you've got a pet lion and you want to take it to see the latest Marvel movie in Maryland, you're out of luck. Massachusetts made it illegal to put tomatoes in clam chowder. This law comes from the 1800s, when there was a fierce debate about what constitutes real clam chowder. Manhattan-style clam chowder has tomatoes. New England-style does not. Massachusetts lawmakers were so passionate about this that they literally made it illegal to put tomatoes in clam chowder. If you're a chef in Massachusetts and you make Manhattan-style clam chowder, you're technically violating state law. In Michigan, it's illegal for a woman to cut her own hair without her husband's permission. This law dates back to the 1800s, when women were legally considered property of their husbands and couldn't make decisions about their own bodies. Obviously, this law is completely outdated and would never be enforced today, but it's still technically on the books. Nobody has bothered to officially remove it, which means technically every woman in Michigan who's gotten a haircut without asking her husband first is a criminal. Absolutely insane. Minnesota has a law stating that it's illegal to cross state lines with a duck on your head. This is one of those laws where nobody knows the actual origin story. It was written in the 1800s, and that's all we know. Historians have tried to figure out why this needed to be a law. Was there a duck hat epidemic? Was this some kind of smuggling technique? Was it a weird fashion trend? Nobody knows, but the law remains, and technically if you're wearing a duck as a hat and you cross from Minnesota into Wisconsin, you're breaking the law. Mississippi made it illegal to teach others what polygamy is. This law comes from the 1800s when the Mormon Church was practicing polygamy and there was a national panic about it spreading. Mississippi decided the solution was to make it illegal to even explain what polygamy is. You can't teach it, you can't discuss it in detail, you can't inform people about it. The law is still active, which means technically this video might be illegal in Mississippi because I just explained what polygamy is. In Missouri, it's illegal to drive with an uncaged bear in your car. This law dates back to the 1800s, when traveling shows would transport animals from town to town, and apparently bears in vehicles was enough of a problem that it needed legal attention. The law requires bears to be caged during transport. It says nothing about other dangerous animals, just bears specifically. So technically you can drive around Missouri with an uncaged tiger and be fine. But if that tiger is a bear, you're breaking the law. Montana has a law that makes it illegal for married women to go fishing alone on Sundays. This law comes from the 1800s when Sundays were considered a day of rest and family time. And apparently lawmakers thought women fishing alone was some kind of moral problem. Single women could fish alone on Sundays just fine, but if you were married, you needed your husband with you. This law has never been repealed, so every married woman who's gone fishing alone on a Sunday in Montana is technically a criminal. In Nebraska, it's illegal for bar owners to sell beer unless they're also brewing a kettle of soup. This law dates back to the late 1800s and was created during the temperance movement. The idea was that if you had to serve food with alcohol, people would drink less and eat more, making them less likely to get drunk. The soup requirement was meant to ensure bars were providing substantial food. This law is still on the books, which means technically every bar in Nebraska that's not actively making soup is operating illegally. Nevada has a law stating that it's illegal to drive a camel on the highway. This law was created in the 1800s when the US Army actually tried using camels for transportation in the desert. It didn't work out, the program was abandoned, but the camels remained. Some people kept them as work animals, and apparently there were enough camel-related traffic incidents that Nevada had to ban them from highways. The law still stands, so if you're one of the few Americans who owns a camel and you live in Nevada, keep it off the roads. New Hampshire made it illegal to sell the clothes you're wearing to pay off a gambling debt. This incredibly specific law comes from the 1800s, when gambling addiction was apparently so bad that people would literally strip down to their underwear in the street to sell their clothes to cover their losses. It got so out of hand that lawmakers had to step in and say, "You cannot sell the clothes off your back." This law is still active, which means if you lose big at a casino in New Hampshire and you try to sell your shirt to pay for it, you're breaking a law that's over 100 years old. In New Jersey, it's illegal to wear a bulletproof vest while committing a murder. Wait, that one actually makes sense. Okay, so not all of these laws are ridiculous. This law dates back to the 1800s when bulletproof vests were first invented and lawmakers realized that criminals might use them to protect themselves during crimes. They decided to make it an additional crime to wear body armor while committing murder. This law has been updated and is still actively enforced today because, unlike the other laws on this list, it actually serves a purpose. New Mexico has a law that states idiots cannot vote. And yes, the law literally uses the word idiots. This comes from the 1800s when states could legally prevent people from voting based on intelligence tests or mental capacity. The law was meant to stop people with cognitive disabilities from voting, which is obviously horrible and discriminatory. While voting rights have been expanded and this law is no longer enforced, it's still technically in the state constitution because removing it would require a constitutional amendment, which is a complicated process. In New York, it's illegal to jump off a building. This law dates back to the 1800s and was meant to prevent suicide attempts, but the way it's written makes it illegal to jump off any building for any reason. So technically, every stunt person who's ever jumped off a building for a movie scene in New York has committed a crime. Every parkour athlete who's jumped from rooftop to rooftop is a criminal. The law doesn't specify height, so technically jumping off a one-story building is just as illegal as jumping off a skyscraper. North Carolina made it illegal to sing off-key. This law comes from the late 1800s and was meant to prevent disturbing the peace with terrible singing. But the way it's written makes it illegal to sing badly anywhere, even in your own home. Technically, every person who's ever sung in the shower in North Carolina and hit a wrong note has violated state law. Every karaoke night in the state is just a gathering of criminals. In North Dakota, it's illegal to fall asleep with your shoes on. This law dates back to the 1800s, and historians believe it was meant to prevent people from passing out drunk in public spaces. If you were sleeping somewhere you shouldn't be with your shoes still on, it was evidence that you were intoxicated and couldn't even undress properly. But the law doesn't specify location, which means technically falling asleep with your shoes on in your own bed in North Dakota is illegal. Ohio has a law stating that it's illegal to get a fish drunk. This law comes from the 1800s when fishing techniques were being regulated. Apparently, some people were using alcohol to drug fish, making them easier to catch. Lawmakers decided this was unsportsmanlike and made it illegal. The law is still on the books, which means if you pour beer in a lake in Ohio, even as a joke, you're technically attempting to commit a crime against fish. In Oklahoma, it's illegal to make ugly faces at dogs. This law dates back to the 1800s when dogs were primarily work animals and there was concern that teasing or scaring them could affect their performance. So they made it illegal to make faces at dogs that might upset them. This law has never been removed, which means technically every person who's ever made a silly face at their dog in Oklahoma is a criminal. Every person who's ever playfully growled at a dog has violated state law. Oregon made it illegal to test your physical endurance while driving a car on the highway. This law was written in the late 1800s and was originally about horse-drawn carriages. People would race their horses on public roads to see whose animal had more stamina, and it caused accidents. The law was meant to prevent these endurance races. But when cars came along, the law was applied to them as well. It was never updated, which means technically every long road trip in Oregon where you're testing how far you can drive before needing a break is illegal. In Pennsylvania, it's illegal to sleep on top of a refrigerator outdoors. This is another one of those laws where the origin story is lost to history. It was written in the 1800s before electric refrigerators even existed, so it must have been about iceboxes. Why were people sleeping on iceboxes outside? Why was this enough of a problem to require a law? Nobody knows. But the law remains, and technically if you drag your fridge into your backyard and take a nap on it in Pennsylvania, you're breaking a law that's over a century old. Rhode Island has a law stating that it's illegal to sell toothbrushes on Sunday. This law comes from the 1800s when blue laws were common. Blue laws restricted commercial activity on Sundays to preserve it as a day of rest and worship. Most blue laws have been repealed, but this specific toothbrush restriction remains in Rhode Island. So technically, every convenience store that sells toothbrushes on Sunday in Rhode Island is breaking the law. You can buy toothpaste, you can buy dental floss, but that toothbrush, illegal on Sundays. In South Carolina, it's illegal to work on Sunday unless you're selling watermelons. This is another blue law from the 1800s, but with a very specific exception. Most commercial work was banned on Sundays, but for some reason watermelon sales were allowed. Historians think this exception was made because watermelons were harvested in the summer and needed to be sold quickly before they spoiled, and waiting until Monday meant losing money. But the law was never updated, so technically you can't work most jobs on Sunday in South Carolina. But if you're a watermelon salesman, you're good to go. South Dakota made it illegal to fall asleep in a cheese factory. This law dates back to the 1800s when cheese production was a major industry and factory safety was a concern. Workers falling asleep near machinery or vats of hot liquid was dangerous, so they made it illegal, but the law doesn't specify that it only applies to workers. Technically, if you take a tour of a cheese factory in South Dakota and you doze off, you're breaking the law. In Tennessee, it's illegal to share your Netflix password. Wait, no, that's a modern thing. Let me give you the actual 1800s law. In Tennessee, it's illegal to use a lasso to catch a fish. This law comes from the 1800s when fishing regulations were being established. Apparently, using a lasso was considered an unfair fishing method, so it was banned. The law still exists, which means every cowboy in Tennessee who's ever tried to rope a fish is technically a criminal. Texas has a law that requires criminals to give their victims 24 hours notice before committing a crime. This law was written in the 1800s and was meant to be satirical. A lawmaker introduced it as a joke to mock other stupid laws being proposed. But somehow it actually passed and became real law. And nobody has bothered to remove it, which means technically every criminal in Texas who commits a crime without giving advance notice is violating this law in addition to whatever crime they're committing. In Utah, it's illegal to cause a catastrophe. This law dates back to the 1800s and sounds like it makes sense until you realize how vague it is. What counts as a catastrophe? Who decides? The law doesn't specify. Technically, if you burn dinner and it causes your smoke alarm to go off and your family has to evacuate the house, Have you caused a catastrophe? Are you a criminal? The law is so poorly written that it could apply to almost anything. Vermont made it illegal for women to wear false teeth without written permission from their husbands. This law comes from the 1800s when women needed their husband's permission for almost everything. False teeth were considered a cosmetic enhancement, and apparently lawmakers thought women shouldn't be able to make that decision on their own. This law has never been officially repealed, which means technically every woman in Vermont with dentures who didn't get written permission is breaking the law. In Virginia, it's illegal to hunt animals on Sunday except for raccoons, which can be hunted until 2 in the morning. This is another Sunday blue law from the 1800s, but with a very specific exception for raccoons. Why raccoons? Why 2 in the morning specifically? Historians think it's because raccoons were nocturnal pests that destroyed crops, and farmers needed to be able to hunt them whenever they were active. But the law is weirdly specific and still technically enforceable today. Washington has a law that makes it illegal to pretend your parents are rich. This law dates back to the 1800s and was meant to prevent fraud. People would pretend to come from wealthy families to gain social status or credit, and then they'd skip town without paying their debts. So lawmakers made it illegal to lie about your parents' wealth. This law is still on the books, which means technically every person who's ever exaggerated their family's financial status in Washington is a criminal. In West Virginia, it's illegal to snooze on a train. This law comes from the 1800s when train robbery was a major problem. Sleeping passengers were easy targets for thieves, and they could also miss their stops and cause confusion. So they made it illegal to fall asleep on trains. This law has never been removed, which means technically every person who's dozed off during a train ride in West Virginia has broken the law. Wisconsin made it illegal to serve margarine instead of butter unless the customer specifically asks for it. This law dates back to the late 1800s when margarine was new and the dairy industry was terrified of the competition. Wisconsin was a major butter-producing state, so lawmakers passed strict regulations to protect butter sales. You cannot serve margarine by default. The customer has to request it. This law is still actively enforced today, making it one of the few laws on this list that actually gets used. In Wyoming, it's illegal to photograph rabbits from January to April without a permit. This law comes from the 1800s and was meant to protect rabbit populations during breeding season. The concern was that photographers would disturb rabbit habitats during a critical time of year. So they made it illegal to take pictures of rabbits for 4 months unless you got special permission from the government. This law is still technically on the books, which means every nature photographer in Wyoming who's ever taken a picture of a rabbit in the spring is a criminal. And here's where it gets really crazy. All 50 of these laws are still technically enforceable. Yes, most of them are ignored. Yes, most prosecutors would laugh if you tried to press charges based on these laws, but they are still part of the legal code. They exist in state law books. They have not been officially removed. So why don't states just delete these laws? Because it's a massive pain. Removing a law requires legislative action. Someone has to propose the removal, it has to go through committees, it has to be voted on, and all of that takes time and resources. And when you've got thousands of outdated laws cluttering up your legal code, nobody wants to spend years going through them one by one to delete the stupid ones. It's easier to just ignore them and focus on actual modern problems. But here's the thing that should actually concern you. These laws show us that legal systems are messy. They're full of outdated rules, contradictions, and absurdities that nobody bothers to fix. And if these obvious, ridiculous laws from the 1800s are still on the books, what other outdated laws are hiding in there? What other stupid rules are you breaking right now without knowing it? The legal system is supposed to protect us and provide order, but when you've got laws about donkeys in bathtubs and fake mustaches in church still technically active, it makes you question the whole system. So there you have it. 50 freaky laws from the 1800s that still technically apply in America today. From Alabama's fake mustache ban to Wyoming's rabbit photography restrictions, these laws prove that history never really goes away. It just gets buried under newer stuff. Some of these laws are funny, some are offensive, some are just bizarre. But they're all real, and they're all still part of the legal code in their respective states. The next time someone tells you that you're breaking the law, maybe you actually are. But it's probably a law from the 1800s that nobody remembers exists. And the next time you think about how modern and advanced our society is, remember that we still technically have laws about camel traffic and pickle bounciness. We've got smartphones and artificial intelligence, but we also have laws about singing off-key and making ugly faces at dogs. These laws are a reminder that change is slow, bureaucracy is messy, and sometimes the past just refuses to let go. If this made you question everything about the legal system, there's another video you need to watch next.